Basic exponential functions come in this form, y equals a times b to the x. So let's remember what each of these things means. Remember that y is our final amount, so this is how much of something we have left over after everything is done growing or decaying, or after a certain amount of time of growth or decay. Now, a is our initial amount, so this tells us how much of something we have at the very beginning before we start growing or decaying, or at, time equals 0 whenever we start measuring. Now, b is our growth rate, so remember that growth rate tells us how fast we're growing or decaying, and so if we're doubling, that would be growth, and it would be multiplying by 2 every time. Now remember, x is time, and time is going to be measured in minutes, hours, years, depends on what our growth rate is. If we're doubling every minute, time would be in minutes. So if you remember that we see exponential growth when b is greater than 1, because it makes sense, right? If I start with something and I multiply it by 2 every time it's getting bigger, or even if I multiply it by 1.01, that means I started with everything that I had and I added 1% to it every single unit of time. Now, if b is in between 0 and 1, it's going to be decay. It's going to be getting smaller because I take whatever I have and I multiply it by, say, 50% or 20%, which is like 0.2. So it's getting smaller. But remember, b cannot be less than 0 because it doesn't make sense to have less than 0% of something. If you start out with 100% of some substance and you keep cutting it in half or do whatever, there's no way that you can have less than 0%, right? There's no such thing. And the same thing for 1. B doesn't make sense to be 1. Because if I have a growth rate of 1, it means I take whatever I have and I multiply it by 1 every minute. Well, if I multiply it by 1, it doesn't change, right? It's not growing or decaying. It's staying exactly the same. So it's not exponential growth or decay at all.